My brother didn't ask if he could move into my apartment. He texted me a list of furniture measurements to see if his king-size bed would fit in my second bedroom. That was the moment I decided I was done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because the bed measurement wasn't where this story started. It started the way most disasters in my family did, at my parents' dining room table, over a meal my mother had spent all afternoon cooking, in a house that smelled like pot roast and unspoken expectations. My name is Sophie, and I am 31 years old. I'm a licensed occupational therapist at a rehabilitation center in the Pacific Northwest, which means I spend my days helping people relearn how to do the things most of us take for granted: buttoning a shirt, holding a fork, rebuilding a life after it falls apart. The irony of my job has never been lost on me. I'm professionally trained to help people regain independence. I just never applied any of that training to my own family. I live alone in a two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood about 12 minutes from the hospital where I work. I got the second bedroom because I work from home one day a week and needed office space. That's all it ever was, my office. A room with a desk, a bookshelf full of clinical manuals, and a window that looks out onto a small courtyard where the neighbor's cat sleeps in the afternoons. It was mine, past tense, present tense. It was always mine. Before I go any further, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. My younger brother, whose name I'll just say starts with a K and who I will refer to as my brother for the rest of this story because he's lost the privilege of being named, is 27 years old. He has been 27 in every sense that matters, emotionally, financially, in terms of personal responsibility, for approximately the last 6 years. He graduated from a state school with a degree in communications, which he leveraged into a series of short-lived jobs at marketing agencies he described as toxic and not aligned with his vision. What his vision was, exactly, shifted depending on the month. For a while, it was real estate, then dropshipping. Then he wanted to get into cryptocurrency, and my parents nodded along like he'd just announced a full scholarship to Harvard. He's the younger one, the only son. And in my family, that combination was treated like a medical condition that required lifelong accommodation. My parents are good people. I want to say that clearly, and I want to mean it, because it's complicated to love someone and also recognize that they have spent 20+ years doing something genuinely harmful without ever meaning to. My dad worked in municipal government for 30 years. Budget planning, city contracts, the kind of meticulous, unglamorous work that actually keeps things running. My mom was an elementary school librarian. They're kind people. They just loved my brother and me in two completely different languages, and only one of those languages came with conditions. When I was 16 and wanted to go on the school trip to Washington, D.C., I had to write a one-page proposal explaining the educational value. When my brother was 16 and wanted a gaming setup for his room, it arrived before I even knew he'd asked for it. When I applied to colleges, my parents sat me down and explained carefully that they could contribute a certain amount per year and that I should apply for financial aid and look into work-study programs. When my brother enrolled in that same state school 4 years later, tuition was just covered. No conversation. No proposal. I'm not bitter about this anymore. I genuinely am not. I've done enough therapy of my own to understand that what my parents gave my brother wasn't love. It was avoidance. They gave him things because asking him to earn things felt harder than just providing them. I understand that now. I didn't understand it at 22, when I was working a weekend shift at a coffee shop to cover my last semester, but I understand it now. What I didn't understand, what I kept failing to understand over and over, was that none of that history had any bearing on what my family expected from me in the present. I bought my apartment 3 years ago. I'd been saving since my first real job, skipping the kind of life my friends were living, the trips, the nights out, the spontaneous purchases, and putting money away every single month with the specific, grinding discipline of someone who knew nobody was going to catch them if they fell. I put down 20%. I negotiated the closing costs. I read every document before I signed it. The day I got the keys, I sat on the floor of the empty living room for about 20 minutes, just breathing. My parents came to see it once, early on. My mother walked through each room, made approving sounds, and then pointed at the second bedroom and said, "Oh, this would be perfect for when we visit." I told her I used it as my office. She said, "You could always use the kitchen table." She wasn't joking. That was 3 years ago. Since then, that second bedroom had been the subject of approximately 9,000 indirect comments. My brother needs somewhere to store his stuff between moves. Can't I just put a cot in there for when the family's in town? Wouldn't it be nice to have my brother closer? And each time I'd deflect, redirect, change the subject. I wasn't brave enough to say no directly. I know that now. I was managing them, the way you manage a conversation you don't want to have, keeping it moving, never letting it land anywhere permanent. The problem with that strategy is that it teaches people you can be managed right back. About 2 months before everything fell apart, my brother lost his apartment. He wasn't evicted, technically. His lease ended and he didn't renew it in time because he'd spent the money he'd been setting aside for the deposit on a branding consultation package from someone he'd met at a networking event. $4,000 for a logo, a color palette, and a PDF of strategic positioning insights that he showed me on his laptop with the expression of someone presenting peer-reviewed research. My parents called me the day his lease ended. Not him. My parents. My mother's voice was very careful, the way it gets when she's trying to present something impossible as obvious. "He's going to stay with us for a little while," she said. "Just while he figures out his next steps." I said that sounded fine. I thought it was fine. For about 3 weeks, it was fine. Then my father mentioned, during a phone call that started as a check-in about Thanksgiving plans, that they were thinking my brother might look at apartments in my neighborhood. I said that was a big city. My mother mentioned, during a separate call, that his job search was going to take some focused time. My brother texted me a link to a coffee shop near my building and said this would be a good spot for me to work remotely. I didn't respond to that one. And then came the Sunday. I drove to my parents' house the way I always did. A half hour on the interstate, the same stretch of highway I've driven 100 times, past the same exits and the same familiar landmarks. My mother had made her roast chicken. She does a roast chicken the way people in my family always cook when they're about to ask you for something. From scratch, with effort, in a way that makes the house smell like warmth and obligation. I walked in, and my brother was already there, which was unusual, because he was typically the last to arrive at everything. He was in the living room with my dad, and when I came through the door, they both looked at me with this very specific expression I can only describe as, "We've already talked about this." Dinner was pleasant, which should have been my first warning. My parents asked about my job. My mother asked about a colleague she remembered me mentioning. My father asked about my car. It was the kind of dinner where everyone is performing normalcy because someone has decided the real conversation needs a runway. Dessert was on the table. My mother's apple cake, which she only makes for birthdays and significant announcements. When my father cleared his throat and said, "We've been talking as a family, and we think we've come up with a really good solution for everyone." I put my fork down. My mother smiled at me across the table. "You have that second room sitting empty," she said, "and your brother needs a quiet place to work and get back on his feet. It just makes so much sense, Sophie. You're there all day. You work from home sometimes. You know the neighborhood. It's the logical thing." My brother was looking at his cake. "How long?" I asked. "Just until he has something solid lined up," my mother said. 6 months at the outside. Maybe less. "He pay rent," my father added quickly, and then my brother looked up, and I could tell from the way he looked up that this was the first he was hearing of the rent part, and he did not love it. I said, "That room is my office." My mother said, "You could use the living room." I said, "I see patients on video call in that room. I have a setup." My father said, "You could move the setup." I said, "I don't want to move the setup." My mother's face shifted, just slightly, into the expression she uses when she feels I'm being deliberately difficult. A kind of patient, wounded look that I spent the first 25 years of my life trying to erase by agreeing to things I didn't want. "Sophie," she said, "your brother needs help. This is what families do." I looked at my brother. He was looking at his plate again. "I need some time to think about it," I said. My mother said, "Of course, take the week." On the drive home, I turned the radio off. I drove in silence for 30 minutes, and I thought about the last time I'd said I needed time to think about something in my family, and how that time had always ended the same way, with me agreeing to whatever had been proposed. because the alternative was weeks of chilly phone calls and my mother's specific brand of hurt silence that she could sustain for longer than I could hold out. I thought about the coffee shop text, the furniture measurements I'd gotten from my brother 2 days earlier, which I hadn't mentioned to anyone because I didn't know what to do with them. I thought about my office, my window, the neighbor's cat in the courtyard. I called my best friend from the parking garage of my building, sitting in my car with the engine off. She answered on the second ring. I said, "They want to move my brother into my apartment." She said, "No, they don't." I said, "They do." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, tell me everything." My best friend, I'll call her by the nickname I've used for her since college, which is just G, is a paralegal at a family law firm. She has seen the full spectrum of what families do to each other in the name of love, and I have never once heard her surprised by any of it. When I finished explaining, she was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Sophie, this is not a request. They've already decided. The only thing that's still being negotiated is whether you're going to accept it or not." I said, "I know." She said, "You've been managing them for years and they've been managing you right back. Every time you've said, 'I'll think about it,' you've trained them to believe that's the start of a yes." I said, "I know that too. So what are you going to do?" I looked out through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking structure. I thought about my apartment upstairs, quiet and mine, with the evening light coming through the kitchen window and the specific silence of a space where nobody could ask anything of me. "I'm going to handle it," I said. "I just need to figure out how." You said, "Whatever you decide, I'm here. And Sophie, you don't have to justify this to them. It's your apartment. Your name is on the lease. They have no legal standing. The only thing they have is 30 years of emotional conditioning, and that only works if you let it." I went upstairs and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The thing about being the responsible one, the one who figured things out, who asked for nothing, who was quietly proud of what she built, is that you can go your whole life being responsible for yourself and still somehow end up responsible for everyone else. I had done everything right. I had studied hard, taken out manageable loans, paid them off early, built a career, bought a home. And somehow, doing everything right had made me the family resource, the backup plan, the person they came to when someone else's plan had failed. I thought about what G had said. The only power they have is emotional conditioning. And I thought about something else, about all the times I had agreed to things I hadn't wanted, and how none of those times had made them see me differently. How my compliance had never bought me the thing I was actually after, which was to be treated like a full person with my own needs that mattered. The approval wasn't coming. It was never coming. I had been waiting for something that didn't exist. By the time I went to bed, I hadn't made a decision yet, but I'd stopped feeling afraid of making one. The texts started the next morning. My mother sent me an article about cohabitation agreements between family members. Apparently, she'd been doing research. My brother texted asking if my parking spot was included with the unit or if he'd need to get a street permit. My father sent a single message that just said, "Your mom is really excited about this plan. It would mean a lot." I read all 3 messages and put my phone face down on my desk. I opened my laptop and I did something I'd never done before. I called my property management company. My lease had 18 months left on it. I asked about the subletting policy, the process for adding an occupant, and, very casually, the way you ask about something you're only theoretically considering, what it would look like to break my lease early. The property manager was helpful. Breaking the lease would cost 2 months' rent. Given what was in my savings account, that was manageable. But here's what occurred to me. Sitting at my desk with my brother's parking question still on my screen, I didn't actually want to break my lease. I didn't want to leave my apartment. I loved my apartment. I loved my courtyard and my kitchen and my office and the specific quality of light in the mornings when I made coffee before work. What I wanted was to keep living in it. I called G back that afternoon. "I don't want to run," I said. "I want to stay. But I need it to be actually mine, not just technically mine. I need them to understand that it's not available to them." "Okay," G said. "Then you don't need to sell or move. You need to say no clearly enough that it can't be reframed as a negotiation." I've said no before. They just wait me out. You've said I need to think about it. That's not no. No is final. No is, this is not a conversation. It is closed. And you back it up with something that makes the no concrete. Like what? G thought for a moment. Like a letter from your landlord. She explained it to me slowly. I couldn't legally prevent my family from visiting me, but I could talk to my property manager and explain that I had family members attempting to pressure me into adding an unauthorized occupant and ask for a formal written notice confirming that my lease did not permit additional occupants without management approval, and that unauthorized subletting could result in lease termination. Something official. Something with a letterhead that I could show my parents and say, "This isn't my decision anymore. The building won't allow it." It wasn't quite true. Management would have approved an occupant if I'd asked. Probably. But the key was that I had no intention of asking. And a letter stating the building's policy on unauthorized occupants was technically accurate. I wasn't lying. I was creating a situation where no was the only possible answer. The property manager was, again, very helpful. She said she'd seen this kind of situation before. She sent me a formal letter by email the following day, on company letterhead, stating the building's policy on lease occupants, which required written approval for any person residing in the unit beyond the named leaseholder, with a minimum 30-day review process and a potential rent increase pending occupancy review. The letter was polite and bureaucratic and completely impenetrable. I read it 3 times and felt something I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a problem that has been solved cleanly. I didn't call my parents. I didn't respond to my brother's parking question or my mother's cohabitation agreement article. I let the week pass. I went to work. I saw my patients. I came home to my quiet apartment and my office and my courtyard window, and I let them wait. My mother called on Friday. I let it go to voicemail. She said she just wanted to check in on my thinking. Very warm, very patient. The voice she uses when she's decided to be gracious about my temporary unreasonableness. I called her back on Saturday morning. "I've thought about it," I said. "Wonderful," she said. "Your brother is so relieved. He was thinking he could be moved in by the mom," I said. "I can't do it." Silence. "I went and spoke with my property management company," I said. "Any additional occupant requires their formal approval, a 30-day review, and would trigger a lease renegotiation. I don't want to risk my lease, I'm sorry." Another silence. Longer this time. "You could have just asked them," she said. "I'm sure they would have made an exception. I didn't ask them to approve it. I called to understand my lease obligations. I'm not going to put my housing at risk for a 6-month arrangement that might run longer. I can't do that. Sophie, your brother needs." "I know what my brother needs, Mom. I know. But I'm not able to provide it, and this isn't a decision I'm making lightly." My mother's voice got very careful. "We've been very supportive of you over the years." I took a breath. "I know you have, and I love you. But my apartment isn't something I'm able to share right now, and I need you to hear that as my final answer." She didn't respond for a moment. Then she said, "I'm very disappointed," and said she had to go. My father called an hour later. His approach was different, calmer. The way he gets when my mother has asked him to try a different angle. He said he understood my concerns about the lease, but maybe I could look into requesting an exception. He said my brother was in a genuinely difficult spot. He said the family needed to support each other. I said, "Dad, I've already communicated my decision to Mom. I'm not going to change it." He said, "Sophie, I love you," I said. "I'll talk to you soon." I hung up. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. What came next was the silence. I had expected the campaign to continue, more calls. My mother mobilizing aunts, family group chats, lighting up with gentle suggestions that I reconsider. What I had not expected was nothing. 3 days of nothing. My brother didn't text about the parking spot again. My mother didn't forward any more articles. I mentioned it to G on Wednesday. "They're recalibrating," she said. "You didn't do what you were supposed to do, so they don't know the next move. The silence is them waiting to see if you'll crack." I'm not gonna crack, I said. I know, she said. Just wait it out. On the fourth day, my brother texted me. Not about the apartment. He texted asking if I had Dad's insurance agent's contact information, which was such a mundane, ordinary request that I almost laughed. I sent him the number. He said thanks. That was the whole conversation. On the sixth day, my mother called and asked if I'd seen a recipe she'd sent in a family email. Just that. The apartment was not mentioned. I understood what was happening. The plan had failed, and they were quietly moving past it. The way my family always quietly moved past things that hadn't worked out. Not with acknowledgement, not with apology, but with a kind of collective amnesia that let everyone pretend the thing hadn't happened. It was both a relief and a familiar frustration. There would be no conversation. There would be no moment where my mother said, "I understand now. I pushed too hard." There was just the subject changing, forever. I was okay with that. About 3 weeks later, I found out through my cousin, who has a gift for knowing everything, that my brother had moved in with a friend from his communications program. His friend had a spare room and was apparently happy to have the company. My cousin mentioned it the way she mentions most things, casually in the middle of a longer conversation, as if it were entirely unremarkable. "Oh, and your brother's set up over at Cody's place now, did you know that?" I said I hadn't. She said, "Oh yeah, he's got a whole setup." Seems good. He had a whole setup at Cody's place, which had always been an option, which had, apparently, become the option the moment mine had been unavailable. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after I got off the phone with my cousin. I looked out through the window at the small courtyard below. The neighbor's cat was on its bench. The afternoon light was coming in at the angle it does in October. That specific low gold that turns everything slightly warmer than it is. I thought about the furniture measurement text, the parking permit question, the roast chicken. I thought about G saying, "The only power they have is emotional conditioning." I made myself a cup of tea and I sat at my kitchen table. My table, in my kitchen, in my apartment, and I let myself feel it fully. Not triumph. Triumph is too loud for what this was. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of something that had been held very tightly finally being allowed to relax. My mother called that weekend for our regular check-in call. She asked about my week. I asked about my week. I asked about hers. She mentioned my brother's new living situation with a brightness in her voice that suggested she'd decided to be enthusiastic about it. "He's really settling in," she said. "It's good for him to have company." I said that sounded great. She asked if I was free for Thanksgiving. I said I'd check my schedule. We talked for about 20 minutes. It was fine. It was, in fact, completely normal, which was its own kind of strange. That something I had spent weeks dreading had simply resolved into an ordinary phone call on a Saturday afternoon. After we hung up, I sat for a while with my phone in my hand. I thought about what I might say, if I ever had the chance to say it directly, that I had not moved mountains or sold everything or disappeared to make this happen. I had just said no. I had said no, and I had backed it up with something concrete, and I had held the line without yelling, without ultimatums, without tears. I hadn't needed to blow up my life to protect it. I just needed to stop giving ground. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I was so convinced that the only way out was a dramatic exit, that I'd have to sacrifice something big to make them understand. What I actually had to do was smaller and harder, and in some ways more terrifying. I had to stay exactly where I was and not move. My apartment still has 2 bedrooms. My office has my desk and my bookshelf and the window where the neighbor's cat naps in the afternoons. Nobody has asked about the spare room since October. Nobody has sent me furniture measurements or questions about parking permits. The cohabitation agreement article is still sitting unread in my email, archived, and I intend to leave it there. Some mornings I make coffee before my shift starts, and I stand at the kitchen window and I think about all the years I spent trying to earn something from my family that was never actually on offer. The specific, equal kind of love that didn't come with conditions or a bill at the end. I'm not angry about it anymore. I'm just clear on it. The way you get clear on something once you finally looked at it directly in the right light. The peace isn't because anything got fixed. It's because I stopped waiting for it to be.